Well, this is David Krayden for the Western Standard, and this is our weekly update. But today it's really all about the last week with the politicians, anyway, of the Emergencies Act inquiry. Now, this has been a long 6 weeks for anybody who was there, and it's nice to see there were so many members of the public there, along with the media, because this was a very important juncture and a very important time in our nation's history. The Emergencies Act was not something a lot of people, including myself, thought was justified. And in the last 6 weeks, we heard evidence from the government and from the Freedom Convoy protesters who were there about exactly what happened. But this week was particularly interesting and riveting because we had, on the last day, Friday, November 25th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appearing. And prior to that in the week, we had the Deputy Prime Minister, Freeland, and the day before that, we had Justice Minister David Lametti appearing. And I'd like to just briefly recap what happened during those pivotal days here, because it really does indicate where the mindset was in this Trudeau government and where the mindset is in terms of how they really view themselves as the people who rule our lives. And it's quite clear they think of themselves as our father figures, really. And it was quite disturbing. But David Lametti, of course, was there, and we learned that he was so freaked out over this Freedom Convoy coming to Ottawa that he wanted to call in the army, the Canadian Army. And he said, "How many tanks do you think you need?" And when this was revealed, of course, the Liberals immediately said, "Oh, we were joking." But no, it didn't look like they were joking. They were so afraid of this peaceful protest. And it just boggles the mind about where their minds were at this time. What were they thinking? Obviously, they were not in the same reality as we were watching this thing in January and February. And I was on the street every day in the February cold, and I didn't see any evidence at all of violence, of insurrection, of any attempt to intimidate people with masks. And we heard this over and over again from all of the government witnesses that these evil truckers and their supporters were intimidating people with masks, swearing at them, calling them names, trying to get them to take their masks off. I saw absolutely no evidence of this in the time I was there. But Lametti, of course, is infamous for his comments at the time of the Freedom Convoy for saying that if people are donating money to Trump-style political vehicles, that they have every reason to be concerned or worried about their financial transactions, about giving financial support to these things. So in other words, if you don't agree with David Lametti and the Liberal government, you should be worried about your bank account being frozen, or you should be worried about being somehow financially buried by this government. This is the Attorney General of Canada talking this way? Absolutely incredible. But he gave no indication at the hearing this week of his changing his mind about that. He was, once again, very, very determined to enunciate his support of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Following Mr. Lametti, we had the Deputy Prime Minister / Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. And I always love to watch Ms. Freeland speak, because it reminds me of a school marm from the old days, or the worst university professor you can ever imagine. And of course, she's not a very tall woman. She has a diminutive stature, but as I like to say, a towering ego and a mammoth arrogance when she is speaking. And you can always tell that she's not quite sure whether people are intelligent enough or smart enough to understand her brilliance. So she carefully enunciates very slowly the words she says, just in case we're not quite swift enough to catch her drift. And she repeatedly did this during her testimony. And it was quite funny at one point. She said she had heard from some unnamed financier that what an unnamed person from America had said that Canada was looking like a banana republic. And she took this to mean that the Freedom Convoy was to blame for looking like a banana republic. But, as I tweeted the other day, no, girl, it was you and Prime Minister Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act, exercising that level of authoritarian control that made Canada look like a banana republic. And so, that was the problem there. And she obviously never got the point. And that was quite interesting to see that she really still thinks that it was the right thing to do. And of course, they all had their talking points throughout the 6 weeks, and Chrystia Freeland stuck to those talking points. And she was sailing through quite well until she hit the government witnesses, or until she hit the Freedom Convoy lawyer, who really pinned her down on a few points. And she had the nerve, of course, to say that freezing people's bank accounts was an economic incentive. And if that sounds Orwellian to you or like doublespeak, it is. That hurt a lot of people. Some people really were financially hurt by that, and it was not an incentive to do anything. How do you get that reversed very, very quickly? Do you swear an oath to Chrystia Freeland to say that you no longer support the Freedom Convoy? None of this was ever addressed, of course. And she also, she talked about the Emergencies Act itself as being a peaceful mechanism. Now tell that to the Mohawk woman who I spoke to the other day, Candy Sorrow, who was trampled by a horse while she was standing peacefully with the aid of a walker. This is a woman who can't even walk very well without the aid and the assistance of a walker. She was trampled by a horse, broke her collarbone, and she told me the other day that she's still in considerable pain as a result of this. Now, that doesn't sound very peaceful to me. And of course, when the police turned on the protesters and started breaking some heads, that wasn't very peaceful either. This was clearly a huge overreach by Justin Trudeau to punish his political enemies. That had nothing to do with quelling any violence. There was no violence, which brings us to the final day of the testimony. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was on the stand for all day, and the government witnesses lobbed these softball questions his way throughout the first 2 to 3 hours of his testimony. And he even then was losing his train of thought at times and couldn't quite get his talking points together at some junctures. But Trudeau, interestingly, admitted a few things to the government lawyers that were quite fascinating. He said, for instance, that it was the threat of violence that compelled him to invoke the Emergencies Act. Now, that's sort of like a police officer saying, I think you look like you're going to rob that bank, or you're going to attack that woman, so I'm going to arrest you first. That's an assumption, of course, and that's not how the law should operate. You should have to break the law first. And he was worried, of course, about violence because he wanted to worry about violence. He did not like these truckers. He did not like what they stood for. They were there to protest mandatory vaccination policies and mandates associated with COVID-19. Trudeau did not like what they were there for, and from the very beginning, he refused to meet with them and dismissed them as an extremist and dismissed them as a lunatic fringe, which of course they weren't. These were blue-collar workers who were there in force, and they were peaceful at all times in the Ottawa sector. And that's of course the only sector that Trudeau ever witnessed of this protest. But Trudeau saved the best for last, and it was near the end of his testimony when he was being grilled by a Freedom Convoy lawyer, and she asked him a number of questions. She read some of the testimonials from the people who were there, and why, and they explained exactly why they were there. And Trudeau sat there stone-faced through most of it, not in the least revealing any empathy or any sympathy for these people, the fact that they had lost jobs, that their lives or livelihood were threatened. He sat there, and quite interestingly, when the Freedom Convoy lawyer asked him, why did you call the unvaccinated misogynistic and racist? Why did you call them names? Trudeau either lied or he forgot his own words. And he said, I didn't call them names. And that to me was the pivotal moment of not only Trudeau's testimony, but the entire week.
People have testified in this inquiry referencing your widely published comments and calling the unvaccinated racists and misogynists. And we have heard testimony in this inquiry about how some of your officials wanted to label protesters as terrorists. Would you agree with me that one of the most important roles of a prime minister is to unite Canadians and not divide them by engaging in name calling?
I did not call people who were unvaccinated names.
Trudeau did his very best throughout the Freedom Convoy protest and in the aftermath to isolate, to dismiss, to marginalize, and to categorize as extreme, white supremacist, racist, misogynistic, any kind of smear he could come up with. These people from the Freedom Convoy. Only because he disagreed with where they were coming from in terms of their philosophy and in their opposition to mandatory vaccines and other mandates associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And he did his very best to smear everybody there, but to actually sit there in the stand and pretend that he didn't do that was really a shocking moment. And of course, I was able to get that information out in my Western Standard column. And I urge you to read that right now. Go to www.westernstandard.news. Have a look at that column, please. And have a look at the associated videos on my Twitter site, because it shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that Justin Trudeau did in fact use names, did in fact smear the members of the Freedom Convoy, did in fact smear these truckers and their supporters in some of the worst language that he's capable of using. And of course, hypocritically, anybody who has had a second career as a blackface performer should not be criticizing or accusing anybody of racism. But he freely does it because he's so narcissistic, he's so full of himself, and so convinced that the story is always about him triumphing over the forces of darkness. And those forces of darkness are anybody who he disagrees with. Misinformation, hate speech are things that he just simply disagrees with. So that was a pivotal moment of the afternoon and of the week. But guess what, folks? It's not ending there. Everybody thinks it's over now that the Prime Minister's testified. As I learned this week, the commission will continue to hear the reports of experts. Now, when I hear that word experts, I get very concerned, because the experts that a parliamentary committee usually calls are sometimes biased in favor of the government. The government is controlling this agenda, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think as anybody who's being honest about in their appraisal of this process. So what kind of experts are we going to hear from in the next week or two? I hope we're going to hear some experts who say that the Emergencies Act should not have been invoked. There was no good reason to do so. There was no real national security concern here. But I fear we're going to hear a lot of experts say, forget what the politicians said. It was the right thing to do because I say so and I'm an expert. So I will be continuing to follow this story next week, and we'll keep you informed about what's going on. But as I said earlier, the Liberal government really has not had a good time with this inquiry, and this week was no exception to that rule. They really have had difficulty convincing Canadians that there was any valid reason to invoke the Emergencies Act. And I think they've already lost the public relations fight. They've already lost the public opinion battle in this. And I think that's not going to change, even if this commission comes back with a report that says Trudeau did the right thing. The experts say so, and we say so too. I don't think that's going to matter in the end, because I think the government's shown itself to be wrong in what they did here. So I urge you to continue to read the reporting in the Western Standard, not just my columns, but my colleague Matthew Horwood and all the other folks who are getting the news out to you in a manner that is honest and frank, because you're not always getting that from the legacy mainstream media. Remember, it's not just the CBC that's being subsidized by the government, and they get complete 100% subsidization. The other media in this country, with the exception of independent media, are getting subsidized by the Trudeau government. And do you think that doesn't affect their reporting? Of course it does. So sign up, subscribe to the Western Standard, log on right now at www.westernstandard.news and have a look at some of the best reporting in the country right now. And it is a riveting media outlet. So I'm going to be back next week. In the future, I will be doing these reports as part of the Western Standard weekly update of my columns. And I hope that's going to start next week. So it's a new venture, but please continue to watch, because I'll be giving you the same straight news up front and honest. And I thank you for listening today. And for the Western Standard and for Krayden's Right, I'm David Krayden.